it's my pleasure to introduce Brett Milligan, who's an assistant professor of landscape architecture at UC Davis. Brett is the founding member of the Dredge Research Collaborative, which curates and designs symposiums, exhibitions, design workshops, and public tours exploring the human manipulation of the sedimentary process. So definitely should go check out this page. There's a lot of really interesting things on there. And I believe Brett said that there's some rumblings about a Delta Dredge Fest sometime in the future. I'll get you on the hook. So prior to coming here to Davis, he was a practicing landscape architect in the Pacific Northwest, working on projects including environmental restoration, dam removal, sustainable urban design, and environmental planning. Brett's research, generally speaking, focuses on the interface between land and water, such as rivers, deltas, canals, ports, and urban waterfronts. Within these landscapes, he explores techniques to meld ecological and infrastructure performance with experiential aesthetics and expanded forms of public engagement, which is a lot of, obviously the content that we'll be covering today. So with that, Brett will be sharing his research about and insights about the Delta and how to create environments that have multi-uses and multiple objectives and all these kinds of fantastic things. So please join me in welcoming Brett.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about some of this work. And I'm just going to go ahead and, given the time, just jump right in. Sounds working okay?
I think so.
Okay. So what do I mean by this term multifunctional infrastructure? This is, for me, a big part of my research and what I'm involved in. And basically, if you take the last 150 years, we sort of had our first wave of infrastructure. And we're sort of rectifying how we sit with that now and how we conceived of that back then versus maybe a more expanded notion of what infrastructure might be. So a lot of this is stemming from, this kind of notion of infrastructural crisis, that we have all this infrastructure we can't sustain anymore. Much of it's falling apart. There's the effects of it, the ecological effects, social considerations that weren't part of that. So how are we going to reinvent or, I guess, refurbish the infrastructure we have is a big part of what my research is concerned with, and I think that more broadly there's a very vibrant conversation about this. So this is where I'm coming from, and if you look in this slide, you can see various things that are very particular to the Delta itself, the state of our levees, the ports, inland waterways. But, this is from the Society for Engineers, and you can see that certain things are starting to show up that formerly were not considered infrastructure. Schools, parks and recreation. In my discipline, we've always thought of that as infrastructure, but maybe less so in the past. So we have this new challenge where I think there's a wider criteria of what infrastructure is and what infrastructure should do, rather than sort of, in the past, we externalize the environment and we externalize social process, whereas how can we reinvent infrastructure where those components actually become the driver of the design? To me, that's a really interesting challenge. So if we translate that to the Delta, I think the notion of the co-equal goals kind of get at this challenge of how are we going to redesign our infrastructure? How do we retrofit it to do perform a wider array of functions? Sometimes we speak of this, at least in my discipline, as landscape performance. What are the metrics of performance and what do we expect from it? So I think the co-equal goals actually get at a whole variety of goals, and thus I think we can think of it as multifunctional infrastructure. So that is a preface. What I'd like to do in this presentation is go through two specific landscapes and explore them in some depth and go through some possible design scenarios for those. One of them within the Delta primary zone, a more rural landscape, and another in the secondary zones in a highly urbanized context, and to talk about the differences between those two. And then after that, I'd like to quickly talk about a project I'm just starting, which is more delta-wide, and it gets into this notion of human use and occupation of the delta. In general, I'm new to the delta, been here for a couple of years. I don't consider myself an expert on the delta, and these projects are sort of provisional. They're in process. They're not finished. They're at a conceptual level. But I think what they offer is sort of a start of some ideas and, concepts, and really create a dialogue of something we might pursue further in terms of thinking of this multifunctionality. And as we go, I think the audience varies a lot in familiarity with these landscapes. So if you have a question, or if I'm going too fast on something, please feel free to raise your hand. I'll take questions as we go.
Services to students
starting with the McCormick-Williamson, sort of in the North Delta in the primary zone. This is within the context of it's very close to Walnut Grove, and here's Locke right over here. Dead Horse Island over towards the north is where the McCollumney River comes in. Sort of a medium-sized parcel, about 1,600 acres, and this is what that tract looks like. It's extremely flat. Agricultural uses. This is during the winter, so it looks a little brown. That's looking across it to a radio tower at the far end. Just gives you a sense of scale. That's that radio tower. And it's surrounded by these sloughs, which is very typical of the delta, and this is the Wimpy's Marina at the very south edge of the tract. History of this was one of the last tracts in the delta to be developed. Around 1920 it was reclaimed. So accordingly, the levees around this island are lower than all the ones of its neighbors by law, and it's been flooded 7 times since that time it was created, mostly catastrophic flooding. And you can see it here in the image in 1986, fully inundated. So the current plan for this island is to convert it into a flood control project. And as part of this flood control project, we think of these projects a little differently now. Along with doing flood control, we're also using it as a restoration project as well. So these are this is the cover report from DWR and the environmental impact report. And the plan you see there is sort of a schematic for, the general idea of how this is going to be performed, where more or less they're going to basically either remove levees or degrade levees to allow water to come in through the north part. Over here, there'll be a breach here for the McCollumney River to come through. This levee will be cut in half, so flood water can go over the top. And then down here at the bottom, you'll have that levee will be removed altogether. Sorry, I just moved and lost everybody. It is working. Okay, sorry. So here's this levee will be removed, so water will come in through here, and it'll be connected. And so there's multiple project elements of how the levees are going to be altered for this. This one showing how the levees will be recontoured to make them more habitat friendly, more robust, thicker. And so this, sort of what this was sort of at a schematic level. And then we were approached by the Delta Conservancy and the Nature Conservancy to look, as well as DWR, to sort of try to get a handle of what this project will actually look like, to visualize it, what the actual things might be there, as well as to start thinking about, in addition to flood control, again, stacking all of these things, flood control and restoration, how might people interact with this tract as well. So we started to visualize, what these actual levees might be like, 3D modeling of the proposed changes in the levees and so forth. Really just trying to get a picture of what it might be like and what sort of recreational nodes might be added to this, such as a kayak station. This one here is modeling the terrain, and you see there's a bird blind for kind of nature watching as you go along the levees. Sort of give you a space, trying to get a real spatial idea of what this might be like. This is our first take at this, at the tract. I should say these are all student projects. These were done by students in our landscape architecture program, either juniors or seniors, and this was for a representation course. So then from that, we took myself and 2 other faculty, Steve Greco and Patsy Owens. We had 4 seniors come and do their final senior project on this tract, which allowed us to look at it a little more holistically. You know, looking at the context, looking at the tract as a whole, and really diving into some of the more technical issues of how this might be converted. So this is looking at the tract in relationship to the past history. This is from the San Francisco Estuary Institute data set, their historic data set of what the delta might have been, versus, you know, what it is now, the sort of changing context, and how those habitats were very much driven by a completely different hydrology, you know, this sort of finer dendritic form of the channels and the tidal flow that still exists in this area, and how that created the environment at the time. We looked at this within a larger corridor that's trying to be created in terms of ecological restoration, the Cosumnes corridor, and then Staten Island down here, this kind of corridor that's being created, as well as sort of the more immediate context. The island's not very accessible as it is right now. There's a dirt road into here this way, but in the future, how do we create these connections to the nearby Cosumnes River Preserve? Locke is just over here, but not connected. Could we put a ferry in? Connections to Dead Horse Island, but really looking at it also from a cultural perspective of how are people going to move through the delta when things like this happen. Additionally, we looked at a lot of the great work that State Parks has done on the delta, looking at, you know, a lot of the recreational needs, you know, in terms of what's there, what isn't, proposing nodes and how people might move through the delta, as well as the boating assessment, which became very critical in this because it's, you know, there's a perceived shortage of boating facilities and boating infrastructure for just how much people use the delta for boating recreation. So all of this kind of informed how we went into looking at the design. I won't go through all this now, but we started to look at the breakdown of how people were using the delta, what types of boating people were doing in the delta, what was the primary ones that people were using, primary forms of boating, and then, you know, also where people were actually spending money in the delta, where was the sort of economic gain, you know, for the delta at large. Threats of, excuse me, I don't know what that is. Something threatening. So we looked at this as well. This is sort of our background research. So what I'll do here is I'll just take you through one of the 4 proposals. This is what one student came up with for her design. This is Katie Herman's project. And what she's showing here is, you know, this is the existing topography on the site. This is only 1 to 20 feet. And those 20 feet are largely the levees around the outside. It's extremely flat. So with this levee burst, this is, you know, sort of a hydraulic look at what would happen in terms of low and high tide across this landscape. Mildly subsided. That's part of the reason why it's being reused is it's not deeply subsided. And then we worked with Bill Fleener on this to actually go from the Center for Watershed Sciences to actually start to do some more hydraulic modeling of what could be possible here. And to try to increase the richness of what might happen across here, she actually proposed some pretty intensive grading to create more dendritic channels within this tract, similar to other sort of naturalized areas within the delta. So sort of a cut and fill operation, and you can see, you know, much more interaction with the water, more, you know, all these gradients and things that would be created. And if you compare that, you can see the original topography versus this, and sort of using GIS, looking at the types of, you get a much greater variety of habitats in here if you do such things. Of course, this would take more money in terms of actually constructing it. And at the time, this was based on a restoration project occurring upstream, a floodplain restoration project where we knew there was going to be a surplus of material, of earthen material that we thought was going to come to the site. So this was a strategy to try to utilize that material. So this was sort of the start of this. I think if we had had more time to work with this, we really kind of started to play with, you know, how much would you actually have to construct each little channel like this, or to what degree could you kind of grossly move material into there and let nature, environmental forces, whatever you want to call them, actually carve that material into the exact shape it would be. So there's a whole dialectic there we didn't get to explore that I think could be refined in this project. But you can see, so the first she did that overlay of how she could create the channels, and then she brought in the recreational components, where here she's creating this master plan that includes boat launches, courtesy docks, and floating campsites down in here in the open water area. and really looking at how different types of boats would be able to use these facilities. Here's another one looking at these campsites, and you can see up here these colored areas where she's showing that she would, above the actual high tide mark, there would be these primitive campsites. Again, another thing that's been identified in the recreational needs, that people really want these primitive campsites that you can only boat into, that are not, just drive your car up to them. And these will be placed in certain areas and also at the same time keeping other areas for more wildlife undisturbed, but actually trying to guide people into certain campsites. There's the overall master plan, including all these boat launches, courtesy docks, places how people could move through this in sort of a watery environment with this ecological benefit. And here's her rendering. These were some of the floating campsites she was thinking of, sort of, very rustic, almost like a floating tent, if you will, that would be on the water. And then you see these lights. She came up with, more or less what she created is this incredible labyrinth, right, which is, you look at historical accounts of the Delta, it was this giant labyrinth you could get lost in. So she started to think about, well, how would people actually be able to be guided through this? And she came up with this, what she called the smart buoy system, which would actually respond to water depth and change in color, so you could actually guide people through these things. So there's a lot of boaters who wouldn't need this, who are experts out there, but people who are more just visiting, whatever, trying to find ways that people just wouldn't get lost out here. And that's sort of another rendering of that. So that's one project where, again, we tried to bring all of these things together to see how they might work. I think there's all kinds of interesting questions that emerge from this project. And now I'm going to switch to a totally different area of the Delta, just across the river from where we are right now, over in West Sacramento. I'm curious, just if people could raise their hands, how many people have heard of the Stone Lock? I'm amazed by this. I didn't know about it until I came across it. It's one of the only locks, industrial locks in California. It's just over in West Sac. And most people don't even know it's there. So this was a studio I taught last quarter, and this was with our senior undergraduate students, one of the advanced studios, just like the other one, a 10-week studio, so a very quick take of what we might see here. And just to give you a bit of context, so here is the Deepwater Shipping Channel, the Sacramento Deepwater Shipping Channel. Here's the Sacramento River right now, and where I'm giving this presentation, we're over here. This is the Stone Lock right here, which was built to connect the Deepwater Channel to the river for barge traffic. So it was built in 1963 and operated through 1982, built and operated by the Army Corps of Engineers. Only lasted for about 19 years and never really actualized the barge traffic it was meant to support. And by the time it was decommissioned, it was 95% recreational traffic using this industrial lock. So again, just on the aerial, Port of West Sacramento, here's basically the end of what's currently used in this infrastructure, the turnaround basin. And then here, this is basically what we considered our site, which is the canal and then the lock over here. So zooming in on there, basically running from Industrial Boulevard in West Sacramento all the way to the river over here. So just to, again, show you some details. Here's this canal. You see it there. Amazingly vegetated on the side, mostly with native oaks and things like that that have just kind of colonized it and have been allowed to colonize it. And then here's the lock. And to give you a sense of scale, from gate to gate, it's about just under 800 feet, about 80 feet wide. I mean, a massive industrial scale lock just sitting out there. It's been sitting there since the mid-'80s. This is an aerial view. You can see this is the view looking west over into the, that's the turnaround basin there going out. Sense of scale, there's the students out there. And I'll come back to this. This is the bulkhead that's now been permanently in place. The gates no longer work, but this is a flood control measure. Again, since these are the gates, you can see there's the students right there. Massive. From the ground. And what's interesting is on the east side of it, this is a road you see under construction, a bridge over the top. This has now been complete. This is to facilitate redevelopment of this entire area. All of the industrial infrastructure is being pulled out of here, and this whole area is reslated for mixed-use waterfront development. And what's also interesting here is you see this was the channel that was formerly kept to a depth of -16, And the Sacramento River, since 1985, has completely filled this in and created this kind of amazing riparian habitat in there. Nobody made this, it made itself, right? But, you know, kind of a rarity along the banks of the river. You can see there, that was the road under construction. This is now complete. And so south of it is this large dredge depot where all the material that was taken out of there was put into here. This is the new highway that's going, or the new road that's going to go through here. And the Army Corps has built this new setback levee. The levee was over here, set it back about 250 feet to take some of the stress off the river. This is what it looked like in 1961, that depot. This is just before it opened. So pretty remarkable piece of history. And so here you see an aerial view. This is that setback levee. Here's the dredge depot, which again has its own kind of feral landscape that's built up upon it on its own. Kind of a riparian forest that is emerging in there. And on the north side, this is the former sewage treatment plant, which has been decommissioned and now replaced by a regional facility. That's what that looks like. So the question came into here. This is the facility itself. What could we do with this infrastructure? You know, one method is to just rope it off and make it a historic relic. But we were like, what actual ecological function might we actually carry through with this? How could it do multiple things? Given this context of urban redevelopment within these secondary zones of the Delta, what's possible here? So we started with, we were able to get a bunch of construction documents from the basement of the lock to actually figure out how it was built. And we built a model of it, modeled it in 3D, and kind of tried to figure out how it worked. We also found this. Did I close that? Okay. All right, there we go. We also found this, the log that they had kept it from 1974, which was pretty amazing to us because it gave us the same datum for both the water levels on the canal side and the water levels on the river side, which, you know, was the whole reason why the lock was built, was to deal with these differentials. And, you know, what's obvious is, of course, if you look at it in a yearly pattern, the Sacramento rises during the winter and spring when it's flooding, as to where this side, the canal side, is very consistent. But if you look at it at a daily pattern, you have a 3.5 to 5 foot variation within the canal from the tide influence, whereas the river is relatively static. We started to think about how could we actually work with these different levels of what's going on with the water. We also looked at 100 2-year floods, the elevations, critical elevations for that. And then you see these two slides. So these are looking at the exact same landscape from back pre-development versus now. So we have a radically altered environment. You see the actual construction of this shipping lane here versus what the river used to be with this wide riparian zone that was in there that's largely gone. So, so returning back to that bulkhead I mentioned, this is the plan for the flood control in West Sacramento. And you see all the levees. The stone lock is right here. That bulkhead you saw in the image is basically holding water back as a flood control measure. But in the long term, what the Army Corps wants to put in here is another, you know, earthen levee, like what's, you know, all around here, fortified earthen levee, as an eventual permanent state for this. So coming into this, students had to deal with the flood control aspect, the urban design aspect, and trying to see what we could augment from an ecological perspective given what was going on there and this kind of unique kind of merging of two watersheds. So I'll go through two of these, students worked in groups on these to come up with a solution. And this first one, you see here's the water over at the front of the river. They've created this very robust riparian zone and then sort of done some interventions back here on the canal. So in general, what we were finding in terms of some of the plans for this is if you go back about to 2003, in this area, they were looking at more a cohesive corridor of public space that might work through here. Whereas over time, as development happens, that tends to get parceled apart and broken into pieces and becomes a non-continuous thing. So we were thinking, how could you actually make this into a regional park that would augment the development while doing these other things as well? So they looked at ways to deconstruct the lock while, relatively keeping it there. So here you see, these are the gates. They blew out the gates here and built this amphitheater at one end, and then basically opened the lock to the channel on this side. So this is what that looks like from above, and created this very shallow slope so that the canal with that tidal influence could actually move back and forth across this, creating this ecological gradient for these different habitats that could be introduced within there. And then, you have this amphitheater that you come up with, and at the end, they basically came up with something that would meet the challenge of this flood control, where the barrier is up at the top of that. So this is a rendering where there's the amphitheater, and there's this kind of earthen levee that's built up for the flood control purpose. But then the canal is allowed to come in here and interact with this, and people sort of look down on it as public space, where it could still have an ecological function. You could potentially formalize it as these different gardens or whatever that would respond directly to the different levels of water going through here. So here's again the whole scheme. So we were just looking at this area here. They also created these, carved out these areas here to manage stormwater, as well as to create more ecological zones off of that canal, again, increasing those edge areas. And then the other big move was we saw that little patch of riparian zone here. They took that and really tried to augment that along this whole corridor, and proposing that that actually continues all the way down with public access along there, with this large stormwater detention basin as a park to take whatever development that's going to happen here. So again, trying to increase the overall patch size that this might have as an ecological system. So here's the view of that. This is, what they call this the green armor, but really fortifying this. So here's the top of that levee. It's basically working like a setback levee that's been extended across the whole way, creating all of these zones across here, which is still doing this purpose of flood control. And there's the basin that's down below. That's kept in here. This is more formalized because it comes into here, but these patches of existing vegetation are retained, and then they brought in an orchard and some other functions as well. So that was one scheme. This is a plan for how that would develop over time. And then I'll show a second one here. So in that first scheme, they dealt with the separation as a typical levee, if you will, but had totally reconfigured how that would work. The second one took a totally different approach, which actually questioned this idea if these two watersheds should be permanently separated, which once you build the levee, they're separate, right? So in the process of doing this, we met with Peter Moyle's group quite a bit and some other aquatic ecologists, and really tried to ask, what would be a beneficial thing to do here for fish? What would be a beneficial thing to do for upland creatures? And we asked this question of, should there be, times when the water is actually able to pass back and forth between the river and the channel? And some of them said no. There's all kinds of invasive species, things, whatever. And others said it might actually be a good idea. There's maybe all kinds of trophic level food web things you might initiate by allowing water to actually get into the deep water shipping channel. The deep water shipping channel is kind of an unknown. Recently we've found delta smelt in the channel. There's all kinds of things we don't know about that channel. And there's all kinds of questions of the viability of that channel in the future, from a trade point of view. So this group took sort of a more radical view on that, where what they wanted to do is to create it so the actual landscape itself was a way to integrate adaptive management into the scheme, where the gates could be adjusted back and forth and actually worked with to see what effects we could get, rather than saying, here's the permanent design and you're stuck with this. So the idea was to actually build it so it would have flexibility as part of what it is. So you see here, they've basically deconstructed the lock as well and installed this gate in the back of it. So this is the Sacramento River side. You see their gate is installed here. If they had more time, they would have had time to work out the gate stuff. That we didn't get that far. But then instead of keeping the walls of the lock, they actually started to pull them back and terrace them to create public space along the sides, while allowing this riparian system to come all the way through the former area of the lock. You see here, they would build this up. This becomes public space. And so here's the former footprint of the lock itself, and you can see now it can inundate in. And then here's this cross-section that shows, you have the development up here, up on the higher areas where it's safe. And then down here, you actually allow the lock to fill with water and have these different layers, or different terraces, where some of these lower terraces can intentionally be flooded. They have plants and things adapted to that. They have urban agriculture, things like that could potentially be inundated, a variety of uses, and they didn't specify what all these could be, allowing that to happen with time. And the big move here again is here's the Sacramento side, this ecology that's already started to happen, this riparian zone. We'd invite it all the way through into here where this gate is kept. It's a gate that allows for movement back and forth of water as we work with it to see what's possible with that. And these gates were considered as, public features in the landscape. We actually call attention to them. You might not be able to get on them, but there's something that people actually engage with to get that this is an adaptive process. This is the dredge depot just to the south, and they installed another gate on this one, which could allow water to come in from the Sacramento River when they want it to, and to create a huge wetland in this area with an outflow gate here, allowing for urban development concentrated on here, which the development itself will be pushed up to a level that was safe by actually carving this thing out to build it. And then you could then, the same kind of thing, you could adaptively manage this. It takes in all the stormwater, drains into here, and gets treated as it passes through. It's actually trying to deal with some of the effects in the secondary zone of the delta, such as stormwater and such, on-site rather than pushing it into the delta itself. This is a rendering of that sort of system, they're coming through here, the process of how we create it. Then briefly on the north side, trying to reuse the infrastructure of the water treatment plant and creating this into a hydroponics site to actually, basically bring a lot of waste from the city to here and actually utilize it as something the city could use. So they call this whole scheme a landscape machine. They're really interested in retooling what a machine is as something that's regenerative rather than that pulls away. See, there's some of the diagrams of how they would develop that. So basically taking a lot of the waste of the city, and this is a rendering of these reuse of the actual infrastructure. So those are two of the schemes. You can see very different in trying to deal with the frameworks that were already in place and to generate some discussion. So those are two particular landscapes. Again, those are in process. We're still probably do follow-up studios on those, take them further. And what I'd like to just finish off with here in the last bit is a little discussion about a wider take on the Delta, a project I'm just getting started with called Human Use of Restored and Naturalized Landscapes in the California Delta, where this is probably familiar to most of you. We're basically working on a delta rewilding scheme where, in an attempt to try to balance some of these infrastructural needs out, turning over a lot of land to make it wild again, to make it, habitat for other species and so forth at a very large scale. And within that, there's all kinds of questions that emerge. We're taking a landscape that we've pretty much domesticated and rewilding it, right? So these are more or less kind of feral landscapes we're creating. We're coming from having, sort of a very heavy cultural use and taking it back. So it's not like it's just wild. It's already had this past history that we're taking it back from. And so, within that, we have the type of creatures and things and a whole different assembly of stuff that's going to happen within these landscapes. And this is for animals and things like that and non-humans, but that also transfers for us as well, right? There's all kinds of cultural ways people want to use these landscapes. There's ways that we find that we prescribe, and there's ways that are unprescribed that people will use these landscapes whether we want them to or not. So this is my only bullet point slide, sorry. But I just want to sort of read through these. These are some of the questions we're hoping to answer in the study. Sort of broadly, what sociocultural land uses might complement large-scale restoration practices and potentially improve their success? So how can these human use within these landscapes actually increase the success of what we're trying to do in terms of restoration? And how might that contribute to a wider range of perceived benefits? On the other side of that, what sociocultural factors might complicate large-scale restoration? We have uses that we don't want people to do, things people might do out there, and how might that be discouraged or channeled somewhere else? Are some forms of unsanctioned or feral uses of these lands benign, inevitable, and acceptable? How do we deal with this? 3, management and scientific monitoring of restored landscapes is itself a human occupation of the terrain. What are the roles and effects of such regulatory and sanctioned occupation of these landscapes? For me, I've worked a lot in the Klamath, and for me that was my experience of just how important it was that actual people who live in these landscapes, how they're interacted with, really had a huge effect on how successful the restoration was. You know, there were areas where they were completely rejected, where state agencies were reviled, and there were areas where they were not, where there was a much more cooperative relationship. So that's a question as well. And then finally, what I'm trying to get at with this first take at the study is, what is the current nature of human use and occupation of naturalized delta landscapes, both prescribed and unsanctioned? What spatial and qualitative patterns can be discerned? So this is what I'm really trying to get at first here, is actually trying to understand it a little bit better. You know, I've worked with scientists on some of these projects where this information is largely sort of an annoyance. It's something that's happening, but it's not really studied in the same way that we're studying all of this non-human stuff. But how can we actually bring that same kind of rigor to our own use of landscapes, our own cultural patterns, our own proclivities? What patterns can we see in large-scale restoration versus small-scale restoration, restoration that's out in the middle of the delta versus restoration that's performed in the urban periphery? You know, there's very different boundaries that get set up in there, how permeable those boundaries are. So these are the general questions I'm hoping to look at. And, you know, we have the delta's always been sort of a cultural recreational area, you know, since we've been in it. And there's some ways there's continuity of that through time. You know, hunting is still a big thing out in the delta, but we're also getting these big shifts in terms of how people use space and what kinds of things people like to do. And in the broader California recreation studies, they've noticed over time less and less interest in hunting and more of an interest in sort of what's called passive nature study. You know, people wanting to go out and actually just look at nature and do those kinds of things, or bird watch. So we're seeing these shifts. And there's other things people do out in these landscapes. You know, this is a floodplain restoration project. These people are actually down on the river. I mean, is this acceptable or not? You know, and here in Sacramento, we all know that the setback levees are also a place where a lot of people live as well, because they have nowhere else to go, and this is where they can actually be left alone. This is something we, you know, have to work with in terms of a reconciliation ecology. What is the answer to this, or is there one? And then sort of a closing slide, you know, two very different uses of the delta, right? We have the one on the left, which is the one I'd say we don't really want, regardless of what your view is on marijuana, but, you know, there's all kinds of fertilizers, all kinds of bad things that kind of happen with this, versus the image on the right, which is the California Phenology Project, sort of a new thing that's really getting citizen scientists out there into these landscapes. I don't think it's really taken off in the delta, and I think there's a huge opportunity where, for scientists specifically, a lot of the field work in some areas is actually being replaced by citizen scientists who want to do this, this is a recreational activity. This is something that I feel like we could do much more with, of actually getting people in the landscape. And not only do they get out there and study things, but then you also have a positive presence that you want in the landscape, right? So I think these are the things that I think we can give more consideration to in sussing out with these restoration plans that we're going forward with, of, you know, where are we as people within it, you know, in these kinds of landscapes. So thank you very much. I'd love questions if you got them.
Okay. Watch me run. If you have questions, both batteries were dead, so.
Hi, Brett. I'm wondering what kinds of groups you're going to be working with, like hunting groups or bird watching groups, to try to get more insight into how people use a landscape, and maybe some of the things, how you get them to reveal things that are happening that aren't supposed to be happening.
Yeah, so I'll be using a variety of methods, and one of the first things I'm trying to do is to reach out to a lot of the land managers and people who are working in the delta already in current projects. I'm already working with the folks from the Center for Watershed Sciences who are helping me with the study in the Casumnas, and there it's a project on the urban periphery, and there's sort of monitoring that's happening in the landscape. So some of it is talking to a lot of these different agencies, Fish and Wildlife, scientists who are working out there, and actually trying to, I'm beginning to try to outreach to all of these folks and to see who we could actually interview, or what kinds of monitoring they have of these landscapes, what's been recorded, what hasn't. And then the actual fieldwork side of, to what degree we'll actually be contacting those people out in those landscapes themselves. I think it'll depend very much on the type of activity, if it's a sanctioned activity versus non-sanctioned or whatever. Some of that might just be looking, there will be a fieldwork component of it. Some of that might be evidence that's found. We would like to also actually interview people who are out there. And again, parks is also done particularly for the recreation. There's a lot of that information that we're going to try to add onto rather than duplicate. But did that answer the question? Yeah.
Anyone else?
I really like this idea of rewilding, and I'm wondering for the old stone canal, couldn't all that structure just be taken out completely and filled in?
I think so. I mean, I think that's one option. I think one question there is, do you lose any opportunities now that you actually have the ability to possibly merge or go back and forth? But I'd say a couple things about that. One of them is I know the Historical Society has just taken an interest in it. So there's people who it's getting close to that 50-year time period where there'll be a lot of people who see it as a historic infrastructure as part of our our heritage, and you might, by totally removing it, even some of the things we did of kind of taking parts of it apart might be seen as more than some people are comfortable with in terms of respecting industrial heritage. But I do think potentially, yeah, you could, in some ways, if you just let the Sacramento River keep doing what it's doing, it'll do it for you, I think. It's, if you just help push it back a little bit, eventually it's filling it in already, if you just sort of coax that dirt back. But I think it's a possibility. You could just fill it all in.
This is just a technology question. How did you take the photos on at Stone Lock where it showed sort of the aerial view and it showed the students on the ground?
Oh, with a drone. Okay. New toys.
I have a question. So, how does this this individual project at the Lock, is that being tied into any other broader revisioning of the waterfront on both sides of the river? So whatever's happening by Raleigh Field and that, and the tank farm just south downriver from there, is this part of a broader project to try to bring these ideas to the regional redevelopment of the waterfront?
Yeah. I think West Sacramento, I think, is really trying to coordinate all of those projects. And there's different, there's Pioneer Bluffs, there's the Stone Lock area. There are different development parcels that they're working with. But in general, there's a whole plan to try to, the idea is to revitalize the waterfront and draw people to it, with mixed-use development, and to relocate all the tank farms and everything that are there now to other areas, which is happening in cities all across the country, this kind of rediscovery of the waterfront. I think the Lock has been this thing that's just sort of been there that no one's known what to do with, because it's obsolete, right? And so that's kind of where we came in, is like, how could we creatively reconfigure it without completely taking it away? Is there an ecological value to it, whatever? So it's long been, if you look at back in plans, like there's a 2002, 2003 waterfront master plan, which was interesting because it covered both sides, sort of West Sac and Sacramento. And there they had sort of proposed an eco-marina. I don't know what an eco-marina is exactly, but that was proposed then, and sort of a cultural center that, that Sacramento part, so that would be, you'd actually dredge out all that material and make that into a marina, which there is a shortage of marina space because there's just so many boaters out there. And then, going back there, it was sort of like a dense urban kind of almost like an Amsterdam kind of thing along the Lock, that kind of development. So I think there's been various plans. I think the Lock has been sort of this mystery thing because no one's known what to do with it.
Did you take a look at how the reestablishment of emergent vegetation would affect mosquito populations, especially in the stone lock area, which is in close proximity to a lot of people?
I mean, I wouldn't say we actually had a chance to study that, you know, in the short pass we would. I think it'd be something to look at. I think right now, the way it is, it's very stagnant back there. It's like a backwater slough, and, you know, it doesn't circulate much. So I think that was, in some ways, if you look at both schemes, they're trying to push away from that to actually get more water movement in there, you know, with allowing tidal flow in there to move it back and forth and out. Or to actually, you know, you have water movement through those adaptive gates. So I think it could be a potential issue to look at in more detail.
So these canal issues, should you actually connect to the main river or totally remove it away from the river?
For the stone lock?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I know it was studied, and if you look online, there's certain things it was looked at for possible fish passage, actually let fish go up that way and around, and I think the general consensus was no. So I think actually fully opening it has been largely discounted by most scientists. I think the question we had is if in storm events or whatever, if you could actually if you're not allowing species to move back, which is one of the main concerns of invasive species and things that are in that canal and in the deep water shipping channel, if you actually could just let water pass into there, you might actually get nutrient flow into there. You might actually jumpstart some of the food web things. I don't know much about this. This is from the scientists who I talk with. You know, that was generally what we were trying to figure out in the studio, and I had, you know, students ran scenarios where they just opened the whole thing up and what would happen. It was sort of pulling back from that is how students arrived at the gate, these adaptive gates, because if you just opened it, you don't really, there's no way we would know what would actually happen. And then once you're stuck with that, then you'd have to come in and do something else if it was totally, if it turned out to be really detrimental. So the idea was to actually be able to move the knobs a little bit to sort of see what might happen if you're actually monitoring it closely.
Well, another question related to your first topic on the track sort of rehabilitation or restoration issues. Have you, for the project, did you or your students actually look at the what type of vegetation you want to put in for as a restoration measure, and then what impact would that have in the, say, long term, say, 50 years, how the vegetation success is going to affect or change the overall terrain within that tract?
Well, like sort of, I think I understand, sort of like the difference between like a horticultural restoration versus passive restoration, or? Yeah, I think largely we looked at it from a passive scheme just because of the scale of it, and particularly in the waterways. I mean, I think the recruitment is very fast in those situations, and I think from a cost point of view, I'm not sure how much you could actually afford to do that. I think in some of the levees on the uplands, there's some of that actually is being done, you know, for different endangered species. I can't remember it all right now, but I think there was some actual planting that was done on the levees to increase that connectivity. But from what we looked at, we didn't actually get to that level of detail of, you know, would you actually try to plant in there? But we had largely looked at, because you're having this, you're basically in a flood situation, letting that kind of modified riparian process actually distribute and recolonize the site.
But the main reason I'm asking about the question was basically that you had some contours or elevation change within the track, so whether that kind of a measure could be reflected on the vegetation differences as well, and that might actually affect the long term in terms of overall sediment deposition or the accrual of organic matter. That will change the elevation even further, and that can, you know, further the vegetation suppression in that matter.
Yeah, and I think there was that question too of the general landform and how much we had to form it, because the way we had done it was, you know, very, very meticulous. What degree could you be more gross about that, and allow some of the process to actually move that into certain places and, you know, get recruitment, but very much based on those elevations would be where the vegetation would crop up.
I think that's a fine place to end it for now. Thank you so much again. That exceeded my expectations.
Thanks for having me.
a couple quick notes. Brett's agreed to stick around for a little bit if you have any additional questions. We've been trying to start this where the speakers don't just come for an hour and go home, but stick around if there's additional questions, so we'll be here for a little while. And then the next seminar is Thursday, February 19th, and it'll be Michael McWilliams here from Delta Modeling to talk about their coupling of hydrodynamic models and historical catch data and thinking about how to model habitat and where fish might be. So keep that one on your calendar. Thanks.